Thank you for inviting me to talk, and I'm hoping to actually discuss what effect COVID-19 has had on the cyber threat landscape and how companies have reacted and how the cyber criminals have reacted to the pandemic and what we can learn from them. So just to introduce myself, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the GRC International Group. And I will sort of go through who GRC International are, because you're probably more familiar with some of its brand names. But I have been a former payment card industry qualified security assessor. I've also been an ethical hacker previously for the company. And I've been a certified information system security professional for about 11 years now. I've always been interested in systems, electronics, computing, and very much hands-on, very technical background. And quite often there's nothing I like better than actually sort of turning a Raspberry Pi or an Arduino into some form of tool to help with ethical hacking and sort of cracking the sort of passwords and getting into hacking into organizations. So GRC International, as some of you may have be aware, it's actually sort of IT governance and its sister companies, including Vigilance, DQM, our publishing division, and e-learning. I'm not going to sort of talk too much about the group, as that's not the purpose of this talk, but sufficient to say that the GRC and IT governance supply a range of solutions that you would be interested in. Well, what I'd like to do today is actually talk about COVID-19 and what changes has that actually caused to sort of IT infrastructure, to the cybersecurity industry, to organizations. And what do those sort of changes mean to the threat landscape, and what sort of countermeasures are required to actually respond to the changes in the threat landscape? And finally, are the changes we've seen permanent or are they temporary? And what can we actually learn from what has actually occurred over the last sort of 8-9 months? So COVID-19 has had a dramatic effect on industry and individuals. What I want to do is actually just start off by introducing what a threat landscape is and what the threat actors are, etc. We're going to go back a little bit in time and sort of mention that the first recorded cyber attack dates back to 1988, which was a worm that became known as the Morris worm, which installed itself on computers, infected them, and actually self-replicated across the network. That was damaging at the time, but the modern cyber attacks are faster, more frequent, more devastating to organizations than those earlier attacks. And it may not seem that sort of first glance that sort of COVID-19 pandemics and cybersecurity actually sort of should be discussed together at the same time. But COVID-19 is an example of a sort of almost perfect superstorm that's occurred in the cybersecurity world, where we've actually got events in the real world that can be used to actually, as part of attacks, etc., as lures. It's also caused changes to the way that organizations have actually worked, which has increased the sort of the threat attack surface area, etc. So this year will probably go down as sort of one of those years where there was a very close to a sort of a superstorm, a perfect storm on the cyber security landscape. So we talk about a threat landscape or a threat environment, which is a collection of threats in a particular domain or with a particular context. It is what an organization will need to understand in order to protect itself. It consists of the threats, the assets, the vulnerabilities, the exploits, and threat actors. Now, the threat landscape is not unique to is unique to all organizations. Although a lot of organizations will have the same vulnerabilities and will have the same threats against it and the same sort of threat actors potentially against them, their actual threat landscape will be individually sort of tailored for the way that the organization works, the field it works in, the current circumstances, and the threat landscape changes like any landscape over time. So we have this sort of threat landscape, and this has been affected by COVID-19. But we also have these sort of threat actors. And when I sort of talk about threat actors, I've seen many one-dimensional lists just listing off the sort of recreational hacker, the malicious insider, etc. But I sort of work with a taxonomy that's basically sort of two-dimensional and indicates the sort of the ability of the attackers as well as sort of who they are and what their sort of main purpose is. So with everything, we get this sort of the newbies, the beginners, and then we get the more slightly advanced youngsters, the script kiddies, before they sort of evolve into sort of a more of a mainstream hacker, and then we get the really skilled hackers at the top, the ones that you really needed to be worried about. But for the majority of organizations, it is actually the mainstream and hackers and the sort of the beginner hackers that are probably 80% of the attacks that you would face. And of course, we've got recreational ones who are sort of more interested in sort of getting notches on their belt about who they actually hacked. All organizations have the threat from the malicious insider. We have the hacktivists, cyber criminal gangs, which have been very active and becoming very prominent in sort of attacks over the last few years, and very much been in the news this year with ransomware attacks on hospitals, healthcare institutions, cities, councils, etc., extorting large sums of money. And if the ransom's not paid, they're actually then doing a further second level of extortion with threatening to release data that they've actually sort of gathered during the attack. And then we've got the state-sponsored, the corporate espionage and sort of cyber terrorists as well. So we got the threat actors and we got the threat landscape. But what has COVID done to actually sort of changed what the status quo was? Why has it actually had a dramatic effect on sort of cyber criminal activity? And what sort can we learn from that? So the pandemic has had its effect on the world. We've all had our own worries about it. We all have our own concerns about it. Governments have been concerned and implemented restrictions to try and stop the spread of it. Organizations have had to adapt, as well as individuals having to adapt. And there's been changes to infrastructure to support that. So while looking at sort of what are the changes was, I sort of read about what the World Economic Forum was sort of saying about the effects of COVID. And they were talking about not just the statistics, etc., because there are many statistics available about the effect of the pandemic. Whether you believe them or not, there is the human cost with a large number of deaths and even larger numbers of people affected. But there's also the sort of the subtle effects that are sort of more hidden. There's sort of the mental trauma, the fear of not knowing what is going on, etc., the worries about the economical, physical environment around people as well. And the World Economic Forum points out that this has been exploited by criminals and hackers. They're using sort of COVID-themed attacks, etc. And if you look at the themes used by attacks over the last 9 months, you can see a dramatic rise in the attacks that are based upon COVID. It shows how the criminals, etc., respond very quickly to sort of the changes that have been going on. So, how this actually affects the actual the landscape, etc. Well, all of us have actually been affected in the UK, and it's the same around the world. We've had new terminology, lockdown, come into sort of use. We've had a lot of people go into remote working, organisations having to adapt from having large numbers of people in their offices to actually having all those people working from home if they can possibly do so. That has required changes to the infrastructure to support that remote working. And the COVID itself, the news, the changes, that's all increased the sort of stress that people are working under, made the sort of the situation more stressful. And one of the things about this is that people make more mistakes when they're stressed, when they're worried. They're more likely to respond to sort of the lures that the criminals are used when they're actually concerned about the lack of information, the changes that seem to be continuing sort of week after week, etc. So this is the sort of the perfect sort of storm that's been building up. We've got people who are going to be more responsive to attacks. We've got changes to the infrastructure. We've got people working in different ways. Different processes need to be adapted, etc. And the cyber criminals sort of really actually get their teeth into this and sort of work their way in, taking advantage of all those changes and the worries to actually increase the sort of the attacks that they actually do on organizations and individuals. You know, for a lot of people, remote working at one time would have been a sort of nice, quiet, peaceful day away from the office to get some work done while it was quiet. But when you have to work at home continuously, you miss the social interaction in the office, the background noise, etc. We are a social species and we need interaction for our mental health. And what's happened over the last 9 months is basically unsettled everybody, making it easier for some of these sort of social engineering that the cyber criminals do to actually sort of take a hold and get people to fall for them. One of the schemes that was very notable for actually using fear as a lure to get people to actually fall for it was a replica of the Johns Hopkins University's dashboard on the spread of the virus, the number of cases, the number of deaths, etc. This website's been visited and been searched for by a lot of people. So the cyber criminals took advantage of that and made a replica of that website. And what that replica did was actually spread malware stealing, password stealing malware across those who actually visited it. So the criminals are sort of taking advantage of sort of the natural fears that we have. But we had changes in the way that people work. And there's been a sort of a new phenomena, sort of another new word into the sort of a lexicon that's been introduced by sort of the pandemic. We've now got used to the term Zoom bombing or Zoom raiding. And it's actually sort of quite interesting to see how a sort of the video platform Zoom has progressed through the pandemic from the sort of the early start of it when it was overwhelmed by sort of organizations moving on to sort of the platform. The insecurities that weren't obvious before became obvious when it was actually being used by a vastly increased clientele and by organizations using it for important conference calls, etc. It's evolved during the months to actually become more secure, But we still have situations where conference calls, online classes were Zoom bombed by uninvited guests, getting their way into those calls and being inappropriate during those calls by showing videos, shouting obscenities, etc. And this has had a big effect on sort of schools and educational establishments. Some have found it so bad with Zoom, they've moved to sort of other technologies such as Teams, etc. But Zoom themselves suffered a lot of bad press about their security and gradually improved their processes, their technology, their security to make it a more secure platform. So those have been a lot of sort of attacks on the way that we've been communicating and working.
Geraint, I'm sorry to cut in at this point, but we're having a problem with the slides. So we wondered if you could perhaps stop sharing them and then reshare them again and see if that gets it fixed.
Okay, give me a second. I'm going to pick the right slide, start sharing again. Is that better?
I can see them.
I'm getting a red rectangle around the slide, so it should be visible.
Yeah, I can see them.
Okay.
Okay, if you'd like to continue then.
That's okay. I do apologise for that. We also follow on from sort of the Zoom bombing. There's also been an increase in attacks used to support remote workers. Many insecurity assert that the main attack vectors through social engineering, through phishing emails, etc. But over the sort of the last 9 months, there's been a dramatic increase in actually the attacks on infrastructure, the attacks on the actual network, and on the use of sort of the VPN and RDP technologies. VPN companies have actually sort of given indications of how much the usage has increased over the last sort of 9 months. And there have been a number of vulnerabilities that I'm actually sort of going to discuss a little bit later on this talk about the way that VPNs and RDPs have been exploited by the cyber criminals. So in terms of the effects of sort of COVID-19 and cyber crime, it has provided really big news. Really big news events are very important to cyber criminals because they can be used as lures.
I'm sorry to cut in again, Geraint. Although I can see them on our feed, they're not going out to YouTube. So I think we're going to have to proceed as though we don't have any slides. So if you could sort of talk without the slides, that would be helpful. I am so sorry. This is live.
Okay. Let me just see if I can put myself. If I stop sharing, people will be able to see me. Hopefully, people can see me. Okay.
Yes, we can see you.
So I'll try and keep pace on what I was actually sort of talking about. So basically, government funds were made available, and again, with the sort of money available, cyber criminals would want their share of it. And there's also remote working, changes to the way that we actually sort of work in terms of no longer being in the office but working from home, having the corporate data outside of the perimeter onto individual endpoints, etc., increase the use of BYOD. So as I said, the really big news is used as lures for the actual spam, phishing and social engineering. The government funds has led to increases in fraud, identity theft, as cyber criminals want to actually get their hands on those funds. And then with the remote working, there's been cyber attacks, ransomware, Beck attacks, business email compromise attacks on organizations. And this is where not actually having the slides available is going to be a little bit difficult because I've got some graphs which I'll sort of try and describe. But if you actually sort of go onto Google and look at search terms, etc., you'll see that the standard terms like recipes and weathers have sort of been fairly consistent over the sort of beginning of 2020. But you can actually see how people have been searching for coronavirus and related terms quite dramatically when you look at the sort of how popular search terms are. And comes to the beginning of March, Google Trends show that the coronavirus as a search term rocketed and became very prevalent over the rest of the actual search terms. People were looking for information, etc. And it makes it easier when people are looking for the information for the cyber criminals to actually supply false information, to supply lures, etc., that will get people to click on sort of attachments or go to malicious websites where they will get a drive-by download. Again, there's a similar graph that shows in March the use of remote working sort of doubling, trebling in actual size as people actually started to work from home as the results of the pandemic being declared and governments asking people to actually work remotely. And there's sort of another set of graphs which basically showed how the sort of the rise in COVID search terms correlates really well with the actual cyber attacks that were using coronavirus as lures. As soon as people started searching, the criminals switched, were very innovative, and actually started using the terms that were being searched for in their malware, in their phishing emails, as part of their social engineering. And there was a dramatic increase with cyber attacks. And within the space of just a month, you were sort of starting to reach sort of 30,000 attacks per day that were using sort of coronavirus as a search term. So the common attack methods that were used during this were sort of social engineering, sort of the phishing, the Beck attacks, sort of authentication attacks, brute forcing, password reuse, credential stuffing. And then we had remote access attacks based upon the VPN vulnerabilities and remote desktops. And actually, those attack methods haven't changed. They were there before COVID-19. They're there again at the moment. They'll be there again in the future. What was different and what COVID enabled the criminals to actually take advantage of was the fact that people were worried, were looking, were searching, were responding to anything that actually had COVID in it. So the attacks are the same. It's just the way they've been deployed, the innovation by the actual cyber criminals has made a big difference to the way that people actually fell for these. There's been an increase in the number of people falling for social engineering, etc. There's an increase in the number of organizations being attacked through VPN vulnerabilities because they switched everyone to remote working, turned on VPN within their sort of gateways without realizing that VPN software had not been updated and there were vulnerabilities in there that could be exploited. So during the year, there's been sort of a 605% increase in sort of cyber attacks related to sort of pandemic between Q1 and Q2. There's been a big increase in the sort of attacks on science and technology organizations. There's been an increase in attacks in the manufacturing sectors, etc. Across the board, there has been increases in attacks on sectors that were not necessarily being attacked so severely beforehand. There's been a dramatic increase in the attack on sort of the healthcare industry, on pharmaceutical companies. A lot of that has been driven by sort of state-sponsored attackers and also by cyber criminals realizing like hospitals, healthcare are more likely to pay up at the moment than they would have done beforehand in terms of sort of getting their records back and being reliant on those records. I had a sort of a very interesting sort of graph from Microsoft themselves about the COVID-19 attacks in the United Kingdom, which basically shows how the volume of attacks and unique encounters varied with events that were occurring in the UK. So how some of these attacks sort of peaked when travel bans were announced, how the volume of attacks increased when there was news about Boris Johnson going into hospital and coming out of hospital, etc. All these sort of events were sort of being used to actually sort of drive the attacks. And there are some very impressive statistics about the attacks. Zoom bombing, which I mentioned, came into use. But in the space of just a couple of months, from March to April to May, there was a 2,000% increase in malicious files with Zoom in the name. There are more than 530,000 Zoom accounts sold on the dark web in sort of May, April time, towards as people were sort of starting to actually use Zoom itself. Tens of thousands of coronavirus-related domains were being created daily. And there are billions of new pages about coronavirus on the actual internet. And this actually led to users being 3 times more likely to click on pandemic-related phishing scams compared to sort of the normal phishing scams. People who would have sort of normally actually spot and think that's a scam, I'm not going to click on it, were now clicking on phishing scams, etc., because they were wanting or desperate for actual information. So COVID-19 provided that perfect storm that caused people to respond to the attacks that criminals were actually launching against organizations and individuals. Now, hopefully you might be able to get a set of slides out and you can see some of these graphs that I'm sort of looking at and we're going to discuss, etc. But there was a very dramatic one from Kaspersky that actually showed the increase in remote desktop protocol attacks and VPN attacks during the course of sort of the first sort of third of 2020. At the beginning of 2020, most countries were sort of seeing attacks, maybe 200,000 attacks per month via the sort of RDP, VPNs, protocols, and network connections. But come at the start of March, those attacks jumped to 800,000, 1.2 million attacks, almost like daily on sort of RDP and VDPN. There was a dramatic increase in sort of attacks on infrastructure once the cyber criminals realized that there was a lot more of vulnerable RDP and VPN infrastructure being deployed by organizations. So what I want to talk about is a little bit about the landscape, the changes to the actual landscape itself. So what has happened over the last sort of 8 months, etc. There's been an increase in state nation ATP attacks on pharmaceutical companies, etc., going after information about vaccines and cures for COVID-19. State nations are actually sort of very keen to actually get as much information about COVID as possible, and they were attacking the research institutions, the pharmaceutical companies, to actually sort of get that information. The cyber criminal gangs also realized that this was an opportunity to actually make money. people were going to be more responsive. There was a lot more lures they could actually use, and they launched a lot more Beck attacks, etc., phishing emails, etc., to actually get money in. But also they realized that a number of organizations were going to be vulnerable to ransomware and be more likely to actually pay. And we see a dramatic increase in this year in terms of ransomware on schools, educational establishments, on hospitals, healthcare institutions, on councils and city, sort of town council, city council, metropolitan area, local authorities, etc., were being attacked, having their systems encrypted, and large demands being made for releasing the information. As well as actually the increase in ransomware attacks, they also evolved. Not only did they just encrypt the data, they stole the data. And if you didn't pay or taken your time to pay the ransom, they would actually make it known that they got that data and would release it if you didn't pay up. They started to put sort of layers of pressure on organizations to pay the ransom. In terms of WannaCry, which is a very famous ransom attack from a few years ago, that raised a few £100,000 for the attackers. Ransomware demands these days are in the millions just for a single event. It has evolved and is a talk in its own right, the way that that's actually changed. So there's been a big increase in the sort of the cyber criminals, the phishing, the Beck attacks. There's been a big increase in the use of malicious software and ransomware on organizations. Some of this is actually not was not unexpected. Back in October 2019, the NSC, the NSA, the NIST all made announcements about vulnerabilities in architectures such as the VPN and RDP, saying that there was a large number of vulnerabilities that could be exploitable in use in products around the world. Those warnings were again repeated this year in July by the NSA, the NIST, the NCSC about insecure VPNs. The actual infrastructure deployed by companies for remote workers had not been patched. The vulnerabilities that were in the products a year ago are still there. They're still being exploited. Organizations turned on VPN without actually patching and updating the gateways, the actual underlying protocols and software and servers to actually supply these services. This gave a really big attack surface area for cyber criminals to actually get into your organization and actually get onto the network and do their own lateral movement and reconnaissance within the actual network. And there were sort of interesting sort of slides and graphs about the way that VPN has been weaponized by vendor and by year, showing how cyber criminals have actually responded and realized what vulnerabilities were there and innovated and weaponized sort of the vulnerabilities to make them into exploits so they can actually gain access to organizations. And there's a sort of a lot of statistics around the actual way that phishing VPN attacks have been successful over the sort of the last sort of 8-9 months. So I want to sort of move on and sort of discuss about the actual changes to the threat landscape. And is it permanent, and what can we actually learn from what has actually happened? So there's been a lot of changes in terms of the attacks, the cyber criminals, etc. Is that permanent? Well, looking at some statistics and research, there's some interesting sort of statistics coming out that show that although there appears to be a lot more cyber criminal activity in the press, the overall levels may not be that much higher than sort of previous years. Yes, there's been an increase, but not as dramatic as possibly the press articles would have actually made out. There's been a lot of attacks based around COVID-19 laws, and those have been sort of very narrowly focused on a particular sort of news event. But if COVID-19 had not happened, then other news events would have been used, and phishing attacks would have been successful, Beck attacks would have been successful. So the landscape is always going to be varying. It's always going to be sort of changing. And the cyber criminals are actually extremely good at innovation and responding to the actual changing environment, the changing landscape. I had a quote about sort of there's nothing new under this sort of the sun, but there's always room to sort of take and those ideas and create and innovate and sort of make new ideas from what's already existed. And that's what the cyber criminals have been doing. Europol's executive director in the foreword to the 2020 Internet Organised Crime and Threat Assessment report states that criminals devise both new modi operandi and adapted existing ones to exploit the situation. New attack vectors and new groups of victims were actually found. So this is sort of one of the things about COVID-19 and the effect on the cyber landscape. It just accelerated the innovation, it provided the opportunities, and those opportunities are going to evolve as the next newsworthy events come along, as everything else evolves, the cyber criminals will change. So the changes caused by COVID-19 to some extent are not going to be permanent, they're going to be temporary, because they're going to be replaced by other news events, other vulnerabilities that can be actually exploited. The increase in the actual number of remote workers post-COVID-19 is probably going to be higher, and there's going to be that newer sort of attack surface of remote infrastructure and sort of looking at sort of the cloud-based services that a lot of people have moved to. So the changes there are permanent, but the actual attacks are going to continually to evolve as the actual landscapes evolve. So cyber criminals will always utilize the sort of news that's currently ongoing. Over the last couple of months, there's been sort of increases in attacks on e-commerce shops during the build-up to Black Friday and the holiday season. There's been a lot of activity around sort of major style attacks on e-commerce organizations because people are buying more online. The cyber criminals will always use the latest news drivers. The US election has been utilized in terms of being a lure for some attacks. Brexit is being used as a lure for attacks and will be for the next few months as well. To get for this, the cyber criminals will use that to get people to actually fall for the sort of the attachments and links that they put in the phishing emails. So actually, what we have in terms of actually countermeasures is everything that we've been doing still applies. It's just that the cyber criminals, the state-sponsored attackers, have modified the way that they work, modified the lures, etc., taken advantage of sort of the fear, the actual lack of detailed information, and try to fill that with sort of malicious links, etc., to sort of suck people in and get them to respond. So doing security assessments, blocking email phishing, using filters, deploying multi-factor authentication, making sure your systems are updated, that the physical security on devices and places and buildings is in place. Implementing encryption and looking at cyber insurance. All the things that we have been doing for the last few years still apply even under sort of COVID-19. We might need to actually deploy multi-factor authentication to people's BYOD devices rather than just corporate phones. We might need to do security assessments of the home environment rather than just the corporate environment. But it's the same solutions to actually protect us now and in the future. If we look after sort of the basics, deploy this sort of the fundamentals and build on the sort of layers of actual protection, we will prevent a large number of these attacks. The takeaways that I want to sort of give are that cyber criminals are continuously evolving and being innovative. COVID-19 just gave them that opportunity. They will take advantage of any situation that presents itself, be it COVID-19, be it Brexit, be it Donald Trump, etc. You need to keep up to date with the current threats, apply the basics, but don't forget that old threats can resurface. There have been cases recently where old vulnerabilities are being reused to attack organizations because people aren't keeping an eye on them. So a lot of the images I used in my slides, which you unfortunately didn't see, are under the Creative Commons license, etc. So I just wanted to sort of say that. And basically, are there any questions?
Well, thank you very much, Geraint. Apologies for the issues with the slides. We'll see if we can attach a link to the YouTube channel so that people will be able to look at them retrospectively. I do have a few questions. One of the questions is about the. In fact, I've just been told that the slides are up on hearts.bcs.org now, so people can have a look at those if they so wish, as we are live. Question for you though, Geraint. Is there any evidence that the rise in attacks is the result of state actors rather than small-scale opportunists? And if so, how do state-sponsored activities differ from hacker groups?
That's actually probably a very good subject for another talk, really.
Excellent, excellent.
There's been a change over the last couple of years in the actual threat actors and the way they actually respond to the way they're actually operating. Now, state-sponsored attackers, yes, there's evidence that they've been more proactive, basically because they've been targeting the pharmaceutical industries, etc. Normally, the state-sponsored attackers are going after the sort of defense companies and sort of government bodies, etc. Over the last 9 months, they've been trying to get information on vaccines, on cures, on the actual disease itself. So they've been going after the pharmaceutical and research companies. And that's been evident from the actual attacks that have taken place with the exfiltration of actual data. State-sponsored attackers use sophisticated tools and very persistent in their actual sort of like their attacks. They're very methodical. They actually do the research. They find the weakest links. They do the research on employees. They may actually attack an organization. So, example, the actual one that's been in the press recently, sort of the attack on the US government departments, etc., has been very prominent because the SolarWinds was actually compromised back in March. So the attacks on FireEye, and on the US sort of departments that have been announced this weekend, they've actually been compromised for about 8 months through this compromised SolarWinds Onion sort of software for network monitoring. And that's what they do. They actually go for the long term. They will actually find suppliers, compromise the supplier, rather than go directly sometimes against the actual target. Now, unfortunately, sort of cyber criminals have been evolving. They have got bigger. They are using more sophisticated tools, and it's becoming harder to differentiate between some of the big cyber criminal gangs and the ATPs, because they're using tools that are just as sophisticated. So the recreational hackers, which are the small individuals, etc., that were popularized in the films in the sort of 80s, 90s, the early 2000s, etc., the loners, etc. Yes, they're sort of using scripts, they're using tools. They're not causing a lot of harm, basically, compared to what the sort of cyber criminals are doing with their ransomware attacks, for example, or their Beck attacks, etc. Business email compromise, where they actually get people to sort of say this invoice needs paying, or actually can you pay this invoice to our new bank account, which is quite the often one. And some of those attacks have been for millions of dollars. They've actually said to they've attacked organizations and said, right, that new building you're building, can you just pay us in our new bank account? And people have not checked and paid millions of dollars to the wrong people, and they can't get their money back. So cyber criminals have become more sophisticated to such an extent there's actually now a sort of a cyber criminal as a service. You can rent the ransomware as a service when you do your attack. The real brains behind it are the ones that have actually gone from being the attackers to the ones supplying the tools to the attackers, and taking a cut for renting out ransomware, renting out lists of known vulnerable VPNs, etc. So, as I say, it's a fascinating area to actually sort of look at the cyber criminals and the way they've been evolving. And we are sort of getting sort of the cyber criminal gangs getting more sophisticated, getting bigger, and starting to match some of the ATPs in terms of sophistication of software. Does that sort of answer that question?
I think it does. There's an associated question, which is, do you think that the public are sufficiently aware that some of these attacks are state-sponsored?
In terms of sort of educating the public, I think that, yes, there is probably a lack of awareness as to what all the attacks are. If you look at all the reports of cyber attacks, you actually sort of seem to think they come mostly in America, etc., or mostly in some other sort of countries. In reality, every country is being attacked. It's just that some countries have got better regulations about reporting those attacks, etc. Now, if we go back to the SolarWinds one, the UK government uses SolarWinds. If you look at the marketing promotional material for SolarWinds, they actually mention UK departments. But so far, we've heard nothing from the UK government, nothing from the UK departments, nothing from the NCSC about successful attacks in the UK. All we've heard about is attacks in the US. So we get this sort of incorrect view of the attacks because we're not seeing the full picture publicly as to what's going on. And attacks are not attributed correctly. Attackers mask their IPs that they're attacking from. And it's easier to attribute the first sort of layer of masking, but it's difficult to dig past that. So you don't know where their attackers are. UK-based attackers don't use UK IPs to attack UK companies. They bounce them around proxies around the internet. So those attacks appear to be coming from elsewhere. So it's very difficult to attribute attacks to various groups. You've got to look at the styles, the software that they're using. And I don't think the public realise just how much cyber criminal activity goes on, how many cyber attacks are actually occurring, or about how close some of those are to actually causing the sort of disaster. There was the article about the death of a single woman in a ransomware attack on a hospital in Germany. The attack caused her to be transferred. But, those attacks are not well documented and not the public aren't educated. And that's one of the reasons why I do talks like this, and other people do talks and discussions around cybercrime and activity. It's to help educate people about the risks.
Okay, could I link a couple of questions now? We've had one that you mentioned a few times that VPNs are a big source of vulnerabilities for organisations, and even more since COVID. Is there any push from organisations to move away from using them? And I'm not sure what that would imply. And in terms of advice you'd give to SMEs, what's the top 5 pieces of advice? In fact, if you don't make 5, just make 2 that you use to protect their data and assets.
Okay, with VPNs, the technology is quite interesting in terms of you can have a sort of a full tunnel where all the traffic comes back to your organisation. You can have split tunnel. A lot of organisations are now sort of working to sort of deploy cloud-based gateways where you use basically TLS encrypted tunnels to the web gateway before you sort of go out onto the actual internet. So basically you use a tunneling process rather than a VPN gateway in your infrastructure. So there are different technologies and architectures that you can use to actually sort of replace VPNs. But the biggest problem with VPNs has been that there are known vulnerabilities that are being weaponized, and organizations haven't updated the firmware basically in the appliances. People know how to update and patch software and operating systems and applications, but how often do you update the firmware on your switches, on your gateways, etc., to actually bring them up to date? So in terms of what organizations can do and SMEs can do, one is actually educate users, because the main attack vector is through social engineering, phishing emails, etc. So very simple phishing training, etc. Teaching people, if they're not sure, ask somebody about, is this a phishing email, etc. So training your end users, turn them from being exploitable into a human firewall that actually protect your organization. And the other one is actually make sure everything you do patch and update your software and your firmware. Those, I would say, are the 2 top ones.
Excellent. Couple of final questions for you. I think at one part of your talk, I was gaining the impression that you were saying that one of the effects of COVID and people working at home is they become more anxious and therefore more vulnerable to what are effectively the same old attacks, although they might be applied in different places. Have you come across anything that's new, anything that you've not seen before, that is sort of an original contribution of COVID-19?
I've not seen new attacks as such. What I've seen is the quite innovative use of COVID as a lure. So, example, there was the John Hopkins website that tracks the number of people infected. People search for that through Google, so making sure that occasionally people will search Google and pick on the malicious one that was listed and go to that and get their machines infected with a malware. It's that style of innovation I've seen. It's taking sort of the normal attacks and actually putting this new veneer on them, this sort of new shininess that attracts people in, and they just click. And when people are worried, when people are actually sort of under pressure, etc., and a lot of people have been, that's when you make mistakes. It's when you try and multitask, when you're doing lots of things at the same time, you're trying to meet deadlines. You've got kids screaming in the background, etc. You've got to take the dog out for a walk, which you don't normally do. It's when you rush in to sort of deal with all that. That's when you make mistakes. And it's human nature. You can't blame people for doing that, but you can sort of try and take the pressure off them, make sure they've got the deadlines, etc. Some organisations were very good and actually rolled out support packages for home workers. I know of an organisation, well, my own organisation actually rolled out Teams channels on helping people to homeschool their children, to share the best tips, etc. Our organisation sort of tried to do the pastoral care of its workers to take that stress away, reduce it a little bit, so we make less mistakes.
You mentioned homeschooling there. I've got a question that is related to that somewhat, in so far as that one of the things about COVID is it's caused us all to retreat to our homes. And organisations like schools and doctors' surgeries, to name two examples, have made far more use of online communication tools than they ever did before. Does this mean that they've become higher profile targets?
Basically, yes. You look at the stats when, because there's not many in the, there's not a lot of information around about attacks on UK educational establishments, although there's been quite a few. But you know, if you look at the American schools, etc., a lot of them have been targeted by ransomware, and there's been educational establishments and schools and such like in the UK that have also been targeted by sort of ransomware. So it has made them a target. Basically, any organisation these days that has become reliant on sort of doing things remotely and the need to share data, cyber criminals have realised that these organisations will pay to actually get the data back rather than go offline, etc., for long periods of time. Typically, from an organisation that I've seen that's been attacked by ransomware, the recovery time can be weeks or months to get back to where they were before the actual attack. And that's when they've got the backups, but because they have to rebuild all their systems, make sure they're clean and hardened before they can put the data back. So it can take a long time. So some organisations, you know, can't survive without, you know, you can't teach people if you don't have the ability to actually send the lessons out. So it has made them more of a target.
Okay, well, I think on that we'll wrap up now. So a big thank you to our speaker Geraint and to all the people who have asked questions. If you've enjoyed this, please make sure you push the like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to be informed about new BCS Hertfordshire content. And look out for more videos coming soon. And just to let you know, our next event is going to be on Monday the 4th of June at 7 o'clock here live on YouTube. And the title is Post-Pandemic Working from Home. So I think that fits in very nicely with some of what we've heard tonight. So please, everyone, stay safe and join us again soon. Good night from all of us here at BCS Hertfordshire.